32 years of accumulated power. That's what Maxine Waters brought to this hearing. 3 decades of destroying CEOs, intimidating witnesses, and ending political careers with her legendary sharp tongue. Jim Jordan, just a wrestler from small-town Ohio, easy target. Your wrestling background may have taught you aggression, she sneered, but this is Congress, not a wrestling mat. Democrats laughed. Cameras rolled. Victory seemed certain. But Waters didn't notice Jordan's calm expression, didn't see him reach for a manila folder, didn't understand why a man being humiliated looked so patient. Wrestlers know something politicians don't. The match isn't over until someone gets pinned. Congresswoman, Jordan said quietly, let's discuss one United Bank, your husband's stock, your family's million-dollar payouts, the taxpayer bailout that saved your investments. Waters' face went white. 32 years of power was about to be destroyed in 47 minutes. This is the story of the most brutal political destruction ever caught on camera. How a small-town wrestler used nothing but facts and documents to obliterate one of Washington's most powerful women. And it all started with her biggest mistake, thinking she had already won. See, while Waters was giving interviews about putting Republicans in their place, Jim Jordan was building the perfect trap: bank records, ethics reports, family financial statements, court documents, every corrupt deal, every family payoff, every lie, all documented, all waiting. The setup was months in the making. Waters had humiliated Jordan before, that viral shut-your-mouth moment during a Fauci hearing that made her a progressive hero and turned Jordan into a laughingstock. She thought she owned him. She thought he was just another loud Republican she could steamroll with her decades of experience. She was about to learn that wrestlers never forget, and they always get their revenge. The hearing was supposed to be routine: banking regulation oversight in the House Financial Services Committee, Waters' domain, her kingdom. A place where she'd made grown CEOs sweat and stammer for over 3 decades. Jordan was there to ask questions about regulatory overreach, standard Republican talking points Waters assumed, easy targets for her legendary sharp tongue and aggressive questioning style that had made her a Democratic icon. What Waters didn't realize was that the quiet man from rural Ohio had spent 3 months gathering ammunition. Not sound bites, not talking points, cold, hard documented evidence of corruption that went to the very heart of Waters' political empire. The wrestler from Champaign County, Ohio, population 40,000, was about to take down the queen of Los Angeles politics. The 2-time NCAA champion who'd never lost a match that mattered was about to pin the most powerful woman in American banking. But first, Waters was going to hand him the perfect opening. Banking committee, her kingdom, her rules. Waters had been planning this public execution for weeks. The man who bullied Fauci was about to get destroyed on her turf. The hearing room was packed, C-SPAN cameras rolling, major networks broadcasting live. Progressive Twitter was already celebrating. Their champion was about to humiliate another Trump Republican on national television. Waters adjusted her microphone, surveyed the room with the confidence of someone who'd dominated this space for 3 decades and prepared to deliver what she thought would be a knockout punch. The moment the hearing opened, Waters struck. "Mr. Jordan," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I want to begin by expressing my deep concern about your pattern of disruptive behavior in congressional hearings." The Democratic side of the committee started nodding. Republicans shifted uncomfortably. This was classic Maxine Waters, going straight for the throat. "Your wrestling background may have taught you to be aggressive, but this is Congress, not a wrestling mat." Pause for effect. A few scattered chuckles from the Democratic side. Waters was just getting warmed up. "Before we discuss serious banking oversight, perhaps you could explain to this committee why you think shouting and interrupting witnesses constitutes legitimate governance." Another pause. More smirks from Democrats. Progressive Twitter was exploding with applause emojis. Then came the kill shot. "Or are you just here to perform for Fox News instead of doing actual work?" The room erupted. Democrats applauding. Media furiously scribbling notes. Republican staffers looking frustrated and defeated. This was the Maxine Waters that made her a progressive icon, fearless, aggressive, taking no prisoners. But Jim Jordan just sat there, perfectly still, legal pad closed, hands folded, that slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Waters looked around the room, drinking in the approval. She was dominating. This was easier than she'd expected. The loud, disruptive Jordan from the Fauci hearing was nowhere to be found. Just a quiet man from Ohio getting publicly humiliated on national television. Sensing weakness, Waters pressed her attack. Like a boxer who thinks their opponent is stunned, she moved in for what she believed would be the knockout punch. Mr. Jordan, your committee has made numerous allegations about regulatory overreach, she continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation. But given your own history of grandstanding and your party's history of defending wealthy donors over working families, why should anyone take your oversight seriously? She paused, looking directly into the cameras. Aren't you really here to protect your corporate donors from accountability rather than conduct legitimate oversight? The attack was devastating, personal, professional, political. Waters had just questioned Jordan's integrity, his competence, and his motives in front of a national audience. It was the kind of political character assassination that had made her legendary in Democratic circles. Republican committee members looked defeated. How do you come back from that kind of public humiliation? How do you recover when one of the most powerful women in Congress has just destroyed your credibility on live television? But then something changed in the room. Something almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it. Jim Jordan's eyes lit up. Just slightly. Most people in the room missed it, but viewers watching closely saw that moment when the wrestler realizes his opponent has just made the mistake he'd been waiting for. Jordan reached for his manila folder, slowly, deliberately, the same way he'd reached for opponents on the wrestling mat, patient, methodical, deadly. When he looked up, his voice was calm, measured, almost conversational. Congresswoman, since you've mentioned legitimate oversight and protecting wealthy donors, I'd like to discuss One United Bank with you. 4 words. One United Bank with you. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Waters' confident expression froze. Her satisfied smile vanished. Color drained from her face like someone had just told her a loved one had died. Her staff started whispering frantically behind her. Democratic committee members suddenly looked confused and worried. They didn't know what One United Bank was, but they could see their champion's reaction. And every reporter in the room who knew Washington politics understood exactly what had just happened. Jim Jordan had just detonated a political nuclear bomb. In 5 seconds, the entire hearing had flipped. The hunter had become the hunted. The prosecutor had become the defendant. The woman who'd spent 30 years intimidating others was about to experience fear like she'd never known. Waters sat frozen, staring at Jordan like a deer caught in headlights, suddenly understanding that the quiet wrestler from Ohio hadn't come to her committee unprepared. He'd come to end her career. One United Bank. 2 words that would haunt Maxine Waters for the rest of her life. 2 words that represented 32 years of power about to evaporate. Waters looked like she'd been shot. Her confident posture crumbled. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. Her staff was in full panic mode, frantically shuffling papers and whispering urgent instructions. Democrats on the committee were desperately asking their staffers, what is One United? The woman who had dominated Washington banking for 3 decades was about to be destroyed by her own corruption. Jordan opened his folder with surgical precision. When he looked up, his voice carried the methodical authority of a prosecutor reading a death sentence. For those watching who may not be familiar with One United Bank, Jordan began his tone almost conversational. Let me provide some context about legitimate oversight and protecting wealthy donors. He pulled out the first document. September 2008, the height of the financial crisis. Congresswoman Waters personally arranged a meeting between Treasury Department officials and One United Bank representatives. Waters tried to interrupt. That was... Ma'am, please let me finish. Jordan continued with devastating calm. What she didn't disclose to Treasury officials, what she didn't tell her congressional colleagues, what she didn't mention to the American people was that her husband, Sidney Williams, owned $350,000 in One United stock. The number hung in the air like a death sentence, $350,000, more money than most American families would see in a decade. Furthermore, Jordan continued consulting his documents. Mr. Williams had served on One United's board of directors from 2004 to 2008. So when Congresswoman Waters called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson to arrange this meeting, she was calling to help a bank where her own family had substantial financial interests. Waters tried desperately to regain control. I was trying to help all minority banks. I had no idea the meeting would focus on One United. Jordan's response was swift and merciless. Ma'am, you personally arranged a meeting between Treasury officials and banks, and you didn't know which bank would be discussed. Either you're lying about your knowledge of the meeting's purpose, or you're admitting to gross negligence in handling conflicts of interest. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Which is it, Congresswoman, deliberate deception or criminal negligence? The question hung in the air. There was no good answer, and everyone in the room knew it. But Jordan wasn't finished. He reached for another document. Let's discuss what happened at that meeting. Treasury officials thought they were meeting with representatives from multiple minority banks. Imagine their surprise when they discovered that One United was the only bank represented. Your husband's bank. Your family's investment. Waters was now visibly panicking. The Treasury Department made their own decisions about— Ma'am, Jordan interrupted. Let's discuss those decisions. One United Bank received $12 million in taxpayer bailout funds through the Troubled Asset Relief Program. $12 million in taxpayer money went to save a bank where your husband owned stock. He reached for his calculator and began punching in numbers live on television. Let me break this down for the American people watching at home. According to your own financial disclosure reports, your husband's One United stock was valued at $350,000 at the end of 2007. This represented between 4.6 and 15.2% of your family's total net worth. The mathematical precision was devastating. Jordan wasn't just making accusations. He was providing exact numbers, specific percentages, documented evidence. If One United had failed as it was about to before receiving taxpayer funds, your husband's investment would have been worthless. Your family would have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Waters tried another desperate defense. I was completely cleared by the House Ethics Committee after a full investigation. Jordan's smile broadened. This was exactly what he'd been waiting for. Ma'am, let's discuss that investigation. The House Ethics Committee found that your chief of staff at the time, who happens to be your grandson Mikhail Moore, was actively involved in helping One United Bank secure federal assistance. The nepotism angle hit like a second bomb. Not only had Waters arranged bailouts for her family's investments, but she'd used her own grandson to facilitate the corruption. Your grandson sent emails specifically about One United being in trouble. He provided the bank with draft legislation. He maintained contact with bank executives on your behalf, all while your family had hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake. Waters was now shouting, My grandson was doing his job. There was nothing improper about— Ma'am, Jordan interrupted with surgical precision. Your grandson used his position as your chief of staff to help a bank where your family had major financial interests secure federal bailout money. That's not doing his job. That's facilitating corruption. Jordan reached for yet another document. But let's discuss how those ethics charges were resolved. The charges against you were dropped, not because you were found innocent, but because it was discovered that the Ethics Committee staff had mishandled evidence in your case. The revelation hit the room like a third explosion. Waters hadn't been cleared. She'd gotten away with it on a technicality. The investigation itself was compromised, Congresswoman. That's not being cleared of wrongdoing. That's corruption so obvious that even a corrupted investigation couldn't ignore it. Waters was now completely flustered, her decades of political experience useless against documented evidence and mathematical precision. This is ancient history. This is a partisan attack. Jordan leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on the moral authority of someone who'd just systematically proven his case. Congresswoman Waters, you opened this hearing by questioning my integrity. You suggested I was here to protect wealthy donors rather than serve the American people. But the documented evidence shows that you used your position to arrange federal bailouts for a bank where your family had substantial financial interests. His voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the room. You called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson to set up a meeting that directly benefited your family's investments. You used your grandson as your chief of staff to facilitate communication with bank executives while your family had hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake. And when American taxpayers bailed out One United Bank to the tune of $12 million, your husband's investment was saved. Jordan's final words came with devastating clarity. You turned public service into a family business. You are exactly what the American people hate about Washington corruption. Politicians who use their power to enrich themselves and their families while working Americans pay the bill. Waters sat in stunned silence, unable to form a coherent response. The woman who had humiliated CEOs for 3 decades had just been systematically destroyed by her own documented corruption. But this was only the beginning. Jordan had much more devastating ammunition waiting in his folder. The wrestling champion from Ohio was just getting started. Waters was bleeding out, but Jordan wasn't finished. Like a wrestler who knows his opponent is weakened, he reached for an even thicker folder marked Waters Family Enrichment. But One United was just the beginning, wasn't it, Congresswoman? Let's talk about the Waters family business, how you turned Congress into a cash machine for your relatives. The second wave of destruction was about to begin. Jordan started reading like he was announcing lottery numbers, each figure more damning than the last. According to a Los Angeles Times investigation spanning multiple years, the Waters family has made over $1 million from your political connections during your time in Congress. $1 million. The number echoed through the hearing room like a gunshot. Your daughter Karen Waters has received more than $750,000 from candidates and committees you've endorsed or influenced. $750,000. More money than most Americans would earn in 20 years of hard work. Your son, Edward Waters, has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from businesses and organizations tied to your political influence. Jordan paused, letting the scope of the family enrichment sink in. And Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a nonpartisan government watchdog group, has named you to their most corrupt politicians list not once, not twice, but 4 separate times during your career. 4 times. Even by Washington standards, that was extraordinary. Waters tried to mount a defense, her voice shaking with a combination of rage and panic. My family members are qualified professionals. They earn their money legitimately. Jordan's response was swift and merciless, delivered with the precision of a constitutional law professor destroying a student's weak argument. Congresswoman, if your daughter is such a qualified consultant, why do her clients exclusively come from candidates who desperately need your endorsement? Why don't successful established politicians use her services? Why don't corporations with no business before your committee hire her firm? He pulled out another document. Because they're not paying for her expertise, ma'am. They're not paying for her consulting skills. They're paying for access to you. They're paying for your political influence. They're paying for your endorsement. Jordan began outlining the family business model with devastating clarity. Here's how the Waters family business works, and I want every American watching to understand this system. First, candidates want your endorsement because you're a powerful committee chair. Second, they hire your daughter's consulting firm and pay her substantial fees. Third, you endorse those candidates, giving them credibility and helping them win elections. Fourth, they continue paying your family members for ongoing services. Fifth, the cycle repeats for the next election. The systematic nature of the corruption was breathtaking. This wasn't isolated incidents. This was a decades-long family enterprise built on the abuse of political power. Let me give you specific examples. Jordan continued consulting his documents. Karen Waters' consulting firm has been paid by candidates in districts you don't even represent. She's received money from candidates running for offices that have nothing to do with banking or financial services. She's been paid by people whose only connection to her supposed expertise is their desperate need for Maxine Waters' political blessing. Waters was now visibly trembling, her carefully constructed public persona crumbling in real time. "How dare you attack my family? They work hard for their money." "Ma'am," Jordan replied with devastating calm, "your family works hard at monetizing your political influence. There's a difference." But Jordan wasn't finished with the family business. He reached for yet another folder. "Let's discuss your work on the Housing Committee, Congresswoman. While you were pushing for regulations that would benefit certain housing developers, those same developers were making very interesting business decisions." He began reading from official records. "They were hiring your husband's consulting firm for substantial fees. They were making donations to your campaigns. They were paying your family members for various services that coincidentally aligned with your regulatory priorities." The pattern was clear and damning. Every committee Waters touched, every issue she influenced somehow resulted in financial benefits for her family. "Do you see the pattern here, Congresswoman? Whether it's banking, housing, or any other issue that comes before your committees, your family somehow finds a way to profit. You've turned every committee assignment, every regulatory decision, every endorsement into a business opportunity for the Waters family enterprise." Jordan's voice took on an almost conversational tone that somehow made his words even more devastating. "You've been in Congress for 32 years. In that time, you've served on multiple committees, influenced countless regulations, and endorsed hundreds of candidates. And in virtually every case, your family has found a way to monetize your political position." He leaned forward slightly. "This isn't public service, Congresswoman. This is a family business masquerading as public service. You've treated your congressional office like a branch of Waters Family Enterprises, where every political decision is measured by how much money it can generate for your relatives." Waters, cornered and desperate, played what she thought was her trump card. "How dare you attack my family? At least we didn't try to overthrow democracy like your party did on January 6th. The words hung in the air for a moment. Democrats on the committee nodded approvingly. Finally, Waters was fighting back. Finally, she was turning the tables and putting Jordan on the defensive about Republican support for Trump. But Jordan's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. Waters had just walked directly into the deadliest part of his preparation. She had no idea what was coming next. The constitutional law professor from Ohio reached for his thickest folder yet, the one marked Waters' 30 Years of Incitement. The wrestling champion was about to deliver his finishing move. Desperate and cornered, Waters had just played her final card. "At least we didn't try to overthrow democracy like your party did on January 6th. It was a Hail Mary, pass an attempt to shift the conversation away from her documented corruption to Republican support for Trump. For a moment, Democrats on the committee looked hopeful. Maybe their champion could turn this around. Maybe she could put Jordan on the defensive about January 6th and escape the systematic destruction of her career. But Jordan's eyes lit up with something approaching joy. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The trap was complete. Waters had just walked into the deadliest part of his preparation. With theatrical precision, Jordan reached for his thickest folder yet. When he placed it on the table, committee members could see the label, Waters, 30 Years of Incitement. "Congresswoman," Jordan said, his voice carrying new authority, "since you want to discuss violence, democracy, and political incitement, let's examine your record of encouraging confrontation and harassment over the past 3 decades. The folder was thick, ominously thick. 30 years of documented statements, quotes, and incidents, all meticulously organized and ready for deployment. Jordan opened to the first section and began reading in his prosecutor voice. June 23, 2018, Los Angeles, California. Your exact words to a crowd of supporters, and I'm reading verbatim from the transcript. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. and you push back on them, and you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. The words hit the room like physical blows. Even Democrats who remembered the incident shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't campaign rhetoric or political hyperbole. This was a sitting member of Congress explicitly calling for harassment and intimidation. Let's discuss what happened after your call for harassment, Jordan continued with devastating precision. Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen was confronted and driven from a Mexican restaurant while eating with her family. White House advisor Stephen Miller was accosted and surrounded while trying to have dinner. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders was refused service and publicly humiliated in front of her children. Jordan paused, letting the consequences of Waters' words sink in. Your call for creating crowds to push back on government officials led directly to the systematic harassment and intimidation of American citizens trying to live their lives. You created a climate where political opponents couldn't appear in public without being mobbed. Waters tried desperately to defend herself. I was talking about peaceful protest. I never called for violence. Jordan's response was swift and surgical. Ma'am, what did you think would happen when you told people to create crowds and push back on specific individuals? What did you think push back meant? Either you're incredibly naive about the power of your words, or you knew exactly what kind of confrontation you were encouraging. But Jordan wasn't finished. He turned to another section of his folder. Let's discuss April 17, 2021, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The Derek Chauvin trial was underway. The city had been experiencing violent riots for days. Buildings were burning. Businesses were being looted. Police officers were under attack. He looked directly at Waters. And you told a crowd of protesters, and again I'm reading your exact words, we've got to stay on the street and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business. The impact was devastating. Waters had told protesters to get more confrontational during active riots where people were already being hurt and property was being destroyed. This wasn't a peaceful rally, Congresswoman. This wasn't a voter registration drive. This was during violent riots, and you told people to get more confrontational. Jordan reached for another document. Let's discuss the legal consequences of your incitement. The judge in Derek Chauvin's trial, Judge Peter Cahill, called your comments abhorrent. He said it was disrespectful to the rule of law and to the judicial branch for elected officials to comment in such a way before a verdict. The judicial rebuke was damning. A sitting federal judge had publicly condemned a member of Congress for potentially undermining a criminal trial. Chauvin's defense attorney requested a mistrial based on your statements. You came dangerously close to causing a mistrial in one of the most important criminal cases in American history because you couldn't resist inciting more confrontation. But Jordan still wasn't finished. He reached for the oldest section of his folder. But this pattern of defending and encouraging violence goes back decades, doesn't it, Congresswoman? Let's discuss 1992, the Los Angeles riots that killed 63 people and caused over $1 billion in damage. Waters looked like she wanted to disappear. After 63 Americans died in riots that destroyed entire neighborhoods, you said, and I'm quoting directly, "If you call it a riot, it sounds like it was just a bunch of crazy people who went out and did bad things for no reason. I maintain it was somewhat understandable, if not acceptable, so I call it a rebellion." The words hung in the room like a toxic cloud. Waters had called deadly riots that killed 63 people understandable and acceptable. 63 people died, Congresswoman. Families lost their homes, businesses were destroyed, communities were devastated, and you called it acceptable. Jordan's voice rose with moral authority. Let me explain the difference between us, and I want every American watching to understand this clearly. On January 6th, I spoke about constitutional processes for challenging electoral votes, processes that have been used by Democrats in 2001, 2005, and 2017. I called for a peaceful, lawful protest within constitutional bounds. You have spent 30 years calling for confrontation in the streets, harassment of government officials, and getting more confrontational while American cities burned. Waters was now shouting completely out of control. I never called for violence. I support peaceful protest. Jordan's final blow was delivered with devastating calm. Then why did you tell people to get more confrontational during riots where people were already being killed? Why did you tell supporters to create crowds to harass specific government officials? Why did you call deadly riots acceptable? He leaned forward for the kill shot. You're either lying about your intent, Congresswoman, or you're admitting to criminal negligence in wielding the power of your words. Which is it? The question hung in the air like a sword over Waters' head. There was no good answer. Jordan stood up, his voice filling the entire room with moral authority. Congresswoman Waters, you began this hearing attacking my integrity. You suggested I was here to protect donors rather than serve the people. But the documented evidence shows that you have systematically used your position to enrich your family for 3 decades, arranged taxpayer bailouts for banks where your family had financial interests, and repeatedly incited harassment and violence in American streets. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more power than shouting. You defended deadly riots as acceptable. You called for harassment of government officials. You told protesters to get more confrontational while cities burned. You are not a public servant, Congresswoman. You're everything Americans hate about corrupt politicians who think power makes them untouchable. Waters sat in complete, humiliated silence. 32 years of accumulated power had just been systematically demolished in front of a national television audience. The wrestling champion from Ohio had just delivered the perfect pin. 47 minutes. That's all it took to end a 32-year career. The hearing room fell into a silence so complete that the sound of air conditioning seemed deafening. Waters sat motionless, staring at the table in front of her, unable to speak. The woman who had dominated Washington banking policy for over 3 decades looked like a broken puppet whose strings had been cut. Her staff sat behind her in the shocked silence, frantically trying to figure out how to recover from what everyone knew was a career-ending destruction. Democratic committee members stared at their papers, unwilling to make eye contact with their devastated colleague. Republican members struggled to contain their amazement at what they'd just witnessed. But outside the hearing room, the political earthquake was just beginning. Within 5 minutes of Jordan's final words, social media exploded like a nuclear bomb. Waters destroyed shot to #1, trending worldwide. The hashtag #HatchJordanDestroys followed close behind. Conservative Twitter erupted in celebration while progressive accounts scrambled desperately to provide context or change the subject. The viral clips were spreading faster than news networks could track them. Jordan absolutely annihilates Maxine Waters hit 2 million views before CNN could even post their own coverage. Fox News immediately went to breaking news alerts. MSNBC anchors looked physically sick as they tried to spin the systematic destruction they'd just witnessed. The key moments were being clipped and shared at lightning speed. The One United Bank bomb, the moment Waters' face went completely white, reached 15 million views within hours. Viewers couldn't get enough of watching the exact second when Waters realized her career was over. The calculator mathematics scene, Jordan breaking down the corruption with actual numbers, hit 12 million views as Americans shared the precise breakdown of how Waters had enriched her family with taxpayer money. You're everything Americans hate about Washington corruption, Jordan's final moral verdict, exploded to 18 million views as the clip became the perfect encapsulation of how ordinary Americans felt about political elites. But perhaps most viral of all was the 30 seconds of complete silence after Jordan finished speaking, Waters unable to form words, sitting in defeated humiliation, which reached 8 million views as people shared the pure satisfaction of watching corruption finally face consequences. The political implications were immediate and devastating. Democratic leadership went into full panic mode. Nancy Pelosi's office released a carefully worded statement that somehow managed to avoid mentioning Waters by name. Chuck Schumer's staff was quietly advising Democratic senators to avoid commenting on the hearing entirely. Progressive organizations that had promoted Waters for decades began quietly removing her from their websites and social media. The squad members who had celebrated Waters as a mentor frantically deleted old tweets supporting her. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had called Waters a hero, suddenly had no comment. Banking lobbyists who had feared Waters for decades were already reaching out to other committee members, sensing that the era of Waters' dominance was over. Meanwhile, Republicans were in celebration mode. Donald Trump posted within an hour, "Phenomenal job by Jim Jordan. Maxine got absolutely destroyed. This is what happens when you fight corruption with facts." Tucker Carlson interrupted his regular programming for an emergency live segment breaking down the hearing. Sean Hannity cleared his entire show to focus on what he called the complete annihilation of Maxine Waters. Conservative talk radio across the country was flooded with callers celebrating the systematic destruction they'd witnessed. Republican donors were flooding Jordan's office with calls. Speaking requests poured in from major conservative organizations across the country. The Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and Federalist Society all extended immediate invitations for major addresses. Political insiders were already whispering about 2028 presidential possibilities. The media was forced to cover the story despite their obvious reluctance. The destruction had been too complete, too documented, too viral to ignore. CNN tried desperately to fact-check Jordan's documents and citations, everything verified perfectly. Their fact-checkers confirmed the One United details, the family enrichment numbers, and the incitement quotes. There was no spinning documented evidence and mathematical precision. MSNBC attempted damage control for their frequent guest, but gave up after 20 minutes when it became clear that defending Waters would only highlight the corruption that had been exposed. Even late-night comedy shows which had planned to book Waters for upcoming appearances quietly canceled her bookings. Stephen Colbert's producers called to reschedule. The Daily Show found other topics to cover. The immediate fallout for Waters was career-ending. Her effectiveness as banking committee chair was destroyed overnight. How could she challenge CEOs on ethics when her own corruption had been so thoroughly documented? Democratic colleagues were already discussing committee leadership changes behind closed doors. Ethics investigation calls were growing by the hour. Republican members were demanding a full investigation into the Waters family finances. Even some Democrats were privately admitting that the evidence was too damaging to ignore. Retirement speculation was everywhere. Political insiders were betting that Waters would announce her retirement before the next election rather than face voters after such complete humiliation. For Jordan, the transformation was remarkable. Overnight, he had gone from being seen as a disruptive Republican gadfly to being viewed as a serious constitutional scholar and corruption fighter. The wrestler from small-town Ohio had just demonstrated that preparation and principle could triumph over decades of accumulated power. The hearing had ended, but the political earthquake was just beginning. This wasn't just a political hearing. It was a masterclass in how preparation destroys power, how facts beat rhetoric, and how one man with documents can topple a 32-year political dynasty. Jim Jordan had just reminded America of something profound in our republic. No one is above accountability, no matter how long they've held power or how untouchable they seem. Maxine Waters entered that hearing room as one of Washington's most feared politicians. She commanded respect from CEOs, wielded enormous influence over American banking policy, and had built a reputation as an unbeatable political force who could destroy opponents with her legendary sharp tongue. She left as a cautionary tale, a living example of what happens when politicians forget that public service is supposed to be about serving the public, not enriching yourself and your family. The career destruction was complete and irreversible. Waters' banking committee authority was gone, vaporized by her own documented corruption. Her progressive credibility was destroyed. How could she claim to fight for working families when she'd spent decades enriching her own family with taxpayer money? Her media appearances were canceled as networks realized she was now toxic. Her political legacy was no longer about civil rights or financial regulation. It was about corruption, nepotism, and incitement. But Jordan's victory provided something even more important than one politician's downfall. It gave every constitutional conservative in America a blueprint for political combat. The small-town wrestler had shown that you don't need big donors, expensive consultants, or media manipulation to achieve victory. You need five things: document everything, stay calm under attack, know the Constitution, be patient for the right moment, and never back down from the truth. Jordan's methodical approach, facts over rhetoric, preparation over position, constitutional principles over political games, had proven more powerful than 3 decades of accumulated political influence. The hearing sparked something deeper than political satisfaction. It triggered an American awakening. Millions of citizens watching realized that government officials work for us, not the other way around. They're not royalty, they're not untouchable, and when they abuse their power, we have the constitutional authority to hold them accountable. Every corrupt politician in Washington got the message: your power is not permanent, your position doesn't protect you, and somewhere someone might be gathering the documents that will end your career. The broader impact was immediate and lasting. Constitutional conservative organizations saw a surge in membership as Americans were inspired by Jordan's demonstration that constitutional knowledge could be wielded as a political weapon. Sales of pocket constitutions skyrocketed as citizens sought to educate themselves about the founding principles Jordan had used so effectively. Law schools reported increased interest in constitutional law programs from students who saw Jordan's performance and realized that constitutional expertise could be a path to meaningful political influence. The idea that substance could triumph over style, that preparation could beat experience, and that constitutional principles could defeat political corruption inspired a new generation of potential leaders. But perhaps most importantly, the hearing established a new standard for American political discourse. Citizens began demanding documented evidence instead of accepting empty rhetoric. They started supporting leaders who demonstrated actual knowledge of constitutional principles rather than those who simply promised popular outcomes. The message resonated across party lines with Americans who were tired of political theater and hungry for authentic leadership grounded in founding principles. Jordan's systematic destruction of waters proved that truth still matters in American politics. Facts still trump spin. Constitutional principles still provide the strongest foundation for political authority, and preparation still beats position every single time. The final scorecard was clear and devastating. Maxine Waters' 32 years of accumulated power destroyed in 47 minutes. Jim Jordan, transformed from small-town wrestler to constitutional hero and potential presidential candidate. The American people reminded that in our republic, the Constitution still matters more than political power. Truth still defeats corruption, and accountability is not just an ideal, it's a practical reality when citizens demand it. The hearing ended with Waters sitting in humiliated silence, but the echoes of Jordan's constitutional lesson reverberated across the nation. He had reminded everyone watching that America was founded on the principle that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that when officials abuse that trust, the people have both the right and the responsibility to hold them accountable. Jim Jordan, the wrestler from Champaign County, Ohio, had just delivered the most important civics lesson in a generation. In America, the Constitution still matters, truth still defeats lies, and sometimes it only takes one prepared person with a manila folder full of facts to remind the entire political establishment that in this republic, no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. That's a lesson Maxine Waters and every other politician watching will never forget.